Hello, everyone, and welcome to Metagov seminar. These are our weekly research presentations that we host at the Metagov community. We invite folks researching digital governance from all around the world to come and share their work with us, and it's awesome to have you all here. And I'll pass the mic to Liz Berry, our executive director, to introduce today's speaker.
Hey, thanks, Val. It's really an honor today to be introducing Luke Thorburn. Luke Thorburn has some very exciting new work out on democracy levels with a large consortium of collaborators, including Aviv Ovadia, who actually was the founder of the deliberative tooling research area here in Metagov, which it's now my honor to direct. So I am really excited to hear from Luke. I always enjoy his presentations. I've actually heard him speak around the world. I think I've heard Luke speak in Nairobi and in maybe Manila. Yeah, so thanks for being here with us today, Luke. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Liz, for that very generous introduction. And apologies from Aviv as well. He's just completely swamped at the moment, but he would love to be here. Let me just share my screen. So this talk is to give you all an overview of what we're calling the democracy levels framework, which was published recently in an ICML position paper with all these wonderful co-authors. I think the talk will be relatively quick, certainly under half an hour, so there should be heaps of time for questions, but the goal is just to sort of motivate it and orient you to the different parts of it. While it's published, it's still, I think, fair to say, a work in progress, and we're iterating on exactly how to factor up the different concepts and dimensions of democratic quality and so on. So any feedback is very much welcome. But with that context, let me walk you through it. And I'll just say also, sorry, I'm presenting within a browser window. There's a couple of other tabs I wanted to flash to at certain points. So that's the motivation for that. So the motivation for this is that we are broadly interested in AI governance and ensuring AI alignment and governance stays broadly human-centered. And to do that, we sort of see that there's like these three levels at which you can steer outcomes. The AI system itself, which is governed by the various alignment processes. There's the organizations that create and operate AI systems. And then there's some sort of external regulator that governs those organizations. And each of these are sort of subject to varying degrees to democratic infrastructure, which feeds back information about what people want when they make decisions of varying degrees of democraticness. And so like at the AI system level, you could think of the training data is in some sense an aggregate of what people express preferences to be in some form. Very imperfect, but that is some sort of aggregation process. And then at the regulator level, there's existing, obviously, democratic institutions that to some extent influence what decisions regulators make. But we think improving this democratic infrastructure is critical for ensuring how AI impacts society and how society changes to adapt to AI stays human-centered. There's lots of examples of versions of this being made explicit in various ways to varying degrees of quality. So at the AI system level, there's things like collective constitutional AI that the Collective Intelligence Project did with Anthropic, where they used Polis to sort of collectively author or generate clauses which would go in a constitution, which is then used to train a large language model. At the regulator level, there's various forms of public input and public consultation into what regulations of AI should be. And there's a spectrum in between. Another big example is Meta's community forums that use Stanford's deliberative polling platform to conduct large-scale deliberative polls on what Meta's approach to sort of policy of how they design their AI product should be. So that, yeah, there's a spectrum here, but we think to sort of ensure that these efforts continue to build on each other and to improve and don't peter out, but progressively become more substantive over time, we need a framework for sort of articulating what success looks like, so that was the motivation for this work. It is more general than just the like AI alignment and governance context, but that's the context in which we're most interested in applying it in the short term. So with that in mind, we propose this framework, which we think, as I just said, can be used as sort of milestones or a measure of, or a way of articulating what the goal might be. It can also be used more practically to help, like, say specifically what is the next step if you've run one of these processes, how do you do a bit better next time? And then equally, it can be used as an evaluation framework to sort of provide a language for talking about how democratic is this thing that we've done. We've run some public input, public engagement, collective decision-making exercise, but how substantive is that really, both by organizations who want to improve themselves, but also by sort of outside observers wanting to hold them accountable to their stated level of democraticness. There's another way of sort of looking at what this framework provides, which is that we think, or to a large extent, the framework as written is kind of agnostic on the degree to which any particular decision should be made democratically. The framework as a whole is more about helping people ensure that to the degree that a given decision should be made democratically, that the process that's used for making that decision, the democratic process or democratic system, is good enough to handle the level of responsibility, like decision-making responsibility that it's handled. And that both of those things are sort of well calibrated to the context in which that decision is being made. Maybe the degree to which a decision should be democratic differs depending on the political context. Maybe the level of democraticness or the quality of a democratic system making a certain decision necessary for being handed that level of responsibility also depends on the context in different ways. So the framework aims to scaffold how to think about those kinds of compatibility issues. Feedback very much welcome on that as well, but let me talk you through it. So the setup is somewhat abstract, but hopefully general in application. So we basically assume that there's these two entities for some given domain of decision making. We assume that there's a unilateral authority that is sort of the status quo decision maker who has the power to make that decision. And then there's some alternative democratic system which could be used to make that decision. For the moment, we abstract away exactly what that democratic system looks like and how good it is and how it's designed. But the core of the framework is about the transfer of decision-making power or responsibility from this unilateral authority to the democratic system. And this is inspired a little bit by, some of you might have seen, there's these, in a completely different context, but so for self-driving cars, this is the Wikipedia page for self-driving car. There's a fairly widely adopted standard on autonomy levels or automation levels for self-driving cars, which is used for basically characterizing how much decision-making responsibility has been transferred from the driver to the vehicle. And obviously, this is not a perfect analogy because in the self-driving car case, it's sort of going from the person to the machine, whereas in our case, we're going from one actor to more people, a more human-oriented approach. But the basic structure of this was an inspiration in that as you increase automation levels, progressively more, or like the domain of decision-making responsibility that the alternative handles, it gradually steps up. And so in our case, we were sort of, the core of the framework answers that question, but for going from some unilateral authority to a democratic system, and we've structured it somewhat analogously. So we have 5 levels. Level 0, there's no decision-making roles performed by the democratic system, so it's just a unilateral decision by the decision maker. At L1, some democratic process is used for informing the decision, but there's nothing more than that, and the unilateral actor doesn't have any, they're not required to sort of take into account that information in any particular way, but that's sort of the democratic process is conducted, and it does notionally inform the decision. At level 2, the democratic process doesn't just sort of inform it, but it provides specific options which could be taken and implemented without any sort of editorialization by the unilateral authority. At L3, the democratic process actually makes the decisions, and those decisions are binding without the ability to veto. At L4, the process doesn't just make decisions, but it has the power to initiate when there should be some democratic process run to make a certain decision. And maybe that's also not just sort of at the discretion of the democratic body or system, but it happens at some regular intervals, or it happens based on some trigger for when a decision needs to be made. So you could think of maybe when a lab is deciding whether it's safe to release a model given a particular set of benchmark trade-offs that they've observed, that might be a trigger that initiates some deliberative process. And then at L5, the democratic system or process is responsible additionally for its own meta-governance. So it sort of has the ability to make binding decisions within a given domain, but can also democratically determine how its own structures and processes evolve over time. So that text on the right is basically what I just said. You might be thinking most of the systems in the world are pretty low on these levels, which is true, but it's meant to be not too constrained by what we have at the moment, but to provide a framework which spans what might be possible in the future or might be desirable in certain contexts. So that's the levels. A second question you might have about this general setup is what does it mean for a decision-making system to be democratic or be good in a democratic way? So for that, we have this second part of the framework, which we call the dimensions, which are broadly dimensions of democraticness or things that contribute to democraticness in a system, which are loosely clustered into 3 groups. So there's the quality of the decision-making process itself. There's the dimensions related to the degree and the way in which the unilateral authority delegates or transfers the power to the democratic system, or I guess more the way they do that rather than the overall degree, because the degree is captured by the levels, but I can talk through each of those if there's interest. And then trust, or what we're calling trust, which is dimensions which relate to like the external conditions or things that are not in the sole control of either the unilateral authority or the democratic process, but the sort of external conditions in which they both exist and help support the success of that democratic exercise. So each of these dimensions has more detailed definitions, which we get to in the paper, and happy to answer questions about any of those. I think if there's one part of the framework which might reasonably evolve a bit over time, it's probably these dimensions, but happy to discuss that. And then there's 2 more questions which you might reasonably ask about this setup. One is, for a given context and a given domain of decision-making, how much power should be transferred, or like to what degree should a given decision be democratic? And then the second question is, given that sort of normative prescription, is a given democratic system that you might be considering, is it good enough to handle that level of decision-making responsibility? And so we don't have nice, clean answers for either of these questions because they're obviously contested and very complicated and context-specific, but we do have some tools for helping think them through, which are namely the levels decision tool and the democratic system card, or what we're calling those two things. So the levels decision tool, don't worry if you can't read this, I'll show you a closer version in a second, but this is what it looks like in the paper. It's basically a list of considerations for or reasons why you might think more democracy or less democracy is desirable, normatively desirable in a given context. So let me just, I'll just mention now, there's a website, democracylevels.org, that has a bunch of resources related to this paper, including the ones I'm about to show you. But from there is linked a template for both the tools. Let me zoom in a little bit. So this is the levels decision tool template, and you can see it's basically just a clustered list of considerations. But so, for example, if the decision involves values-laden trade-offs, if it involves significant public interest concerns or externalities, then there are reasons why you might want it to be more democratic. If it's a private technical or operational matter and doesn't involve too much in the way of normative considerations, that's probably less likely to need democratic legitimacy, and so on. So there's a long list of considerations here, many of which are quite sort of practical in nature. If you're like leading an organization who the actions you take have an impact on society, but you don't, obviously not every decision you make as an organization can be made perfectly democratically or seeking significant external engagement because there's significant costs involved to that. This is a set of considerations that can help you think through in a particular domain whether a given decision should be democratic or not. And then, so that's the levels decision tool. The second tool is a democratic system card, which is to answer that second question about, is a given democratic process good enough to handle the level of decision-making responsibility that is handed to it at a given democracy level. And so again, this is the sort of formatting of that in the paper, but we have linked on the website a more usable version of that. And basically what this is a set of questions for helping you both describe how each of these dimensions that I introduced earlier, how each of those is operationalized in your system, and then evaluating the degree to which they, not just how they operationalize, but the degree to which those dimensions are met or fulfilled by your system. So, for example, informedness we define as the extent to which those making decisions understand the information critical to making that decision. So there's a spot to describe how that works in your context. And then there's a bunch of sort of questions to prompt whether, or yeah, how well that's implemented, and could it be better, and what are the limitations, and so on. So this doesn't lead you to like a definitive quantitative score on how democratic is the system, but it does help you flesh out ways in which the system can be more or less democratic, and reflect on that, and reflect on whether the system is sort of good enough to handle the level of responsibility that's being handed to it. There's a couple of examples on the website as well. There's an example in this doc as well for a hypothetical UK Citizens Assembly where you can scroll through and see like what some answers to these questions might look like in practice. So I'll finish there, but happy to answer any and all questions about this. These are the wonderful co-authors from many different places in the general community. Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to questions and discussion.
Oh, thank you so much, Luke. This was fantastic. And your presentation was so clear. I feel like this is such a gift to the ecosystem to give these kind of handholds into the way of thinking about these big topics. So yeah, thank you for this presentation. And that slide of collaborators at the end is so powerful. Val is asking for links, but let's take a look in the chat and see if we have any questions. I had posted a question from much earlier in your presentation, back when you were talking about the domains of democratic AI, pluralistic AI, and public AI ecosystems. That caught my attention early on in your presentation because Metagov has we're part of a large advocacy initiative around public AI. And I'm interested to hear from you about your view into these ecosystems and where you suggest your democracy levels framework could be used as part of advocacy.
Yeah, I'll preface this by just saying I'm speaking for myself. I can't claim to speak for all those authors, obviously, but I think it would be interesting to evaluate existing attempts at or at like examples of, so some of those I've flashed up of ways that say companies or regulators or so on have tried to run these public input exercises, which they often frame in democratic terms, to like evaluate them on some consistent standard, which could be the levels. And I think often you would find that they're all quite low down. But that's a sort of like a useful signal. I think there's like you can just show the gap between maybe there's domains where you think there's a convincing case that a high level of democracy is required, and in practice that's not being achieved. So there's that sort of accountability mechanism. That's pretty general. Did you have like a more specific context or communities or
I'll just take this as a follow-up that there's other advocacy threads out there for democratic AI and pluralistic AI, in addition to what over here at Metagov we've been pushing for public AI. And yes, it's been more of a campaign for public investment as a confrontation to the oligarchic control of AI that currently exists. And yeah, I'll hold this question open and look for places that your democracy levels framework could get a little closer to our project there.
Yeah,
but I know that was just in the intro. That wasn't even like the substance of what you came here to present. So let's look over.
Connects to the public AI work, if that's how I think it connects. I guess in my head, even if public AI is super successful at getting up public funding for foundation models, there's still a lot of decisions about how the use of that model impacts society, and it would probably suffer from a lot of the standard limitations of there just being a relatively low sort of low bandwidth information channel between the public that model and the use of that model is meant to represent and the things it actually does in the world. So there's probably lots of implicit decisions that are being made in the design of that whole paradigm and the way it's operationalized, which within each of those, you could like identify particular domains of decision making, and maybe some of those decisions someone is actually making, a regulator or someone or some series of committees. Other decisions might be being made just sort of implicitly or by default in the way the system has been set up, with no one sort of explicitly expressing their view on that particular thing. But I think I guess just because something is publicly funded, it doesn't mean that the critical decisions about its design are highly democratic in the terms of the dimensions that we flesh out here. And obviously it creates the possibility for that level of input and contestation and accountability and so on. But I think there's like, even in the world where public AI is very sort of successful, I think there's still room for like evaluating to what degree is public AI and the way it impacts the world democratic in various different ways, which is the framework slots in.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. So I see, Steve, you have your hand up. Do you have a direct response or question on this specific topic, or can I keep going through the order in chat?
Yeah, just, I mean, I'm very much along the lines of Joseph's question, but I do have a particular viewpoint I want to express afterwards, perhaps.
Okay, great. So hold and let me go through the side. I wanted to kind of stay at the very high level and the framing level that Luke started with, and just ask, can you just unpack a little bit the conversation that you all had when you're like, let's compare a democratic system to a self-driving car? That is a fantastical, I mean, I can see it, but could you just describe a little bit like what work that metaphor does for you, and then where does it maybe need to be left behind when talking about democracy?
Yeah, completely fair. Like it didn't play a significant role in our developing the framework. It was mainly, well, I guess, so a lot of the talk about democratization of AI, that term is often meant to, well, it's used in lots of different ways, but by a lot of actors, it's used to mean increasing access to use of models or access to open source models or so on. Whereas I guess the like implicit view in this framework is that like more substantive, meaningful democratization means there needs to be some sort of transfer of power from some unilateral or small group of decision makers to some sort of democratic decision-making process or system. And the the role that the self-driving car analogy played is purely in just some inspiration for how people have, in another context, sort of carved up the degrees of transfer of decision-making power. And like it was really sort of in just like the general factoring of that space and how people talk about degrees and breaking it up into like different decision-making roles. That's the extent of the influence it had. But yeah, I completely agree. There's lots of, well, like don't think about it too much because there's lots of flaws in the analogy. It's more just like information design inspiration. Yeah.
Then I'll just mention something that's important from my background in architecture and urban planning is the 1969's Ladder of Participation by Sherry Arnstein. So just as another model of levels of going between government and citizens and how much people are being involved. It might be nice for, an older, yes, exactly.
Yeah, I thought it might come up. And we do cite this in the paper as well. It was also inspiration, I guess. Yeah, like this is also doing a very similar thing. I think ours is maybe sort of well, it's obviously factored slightly differently. I think it's probably like just framed slightly more neutrally in that it, I don't know, there's a lot of sort of like connotations or loading to the terms in this letter, which in some domains of where you're trying to change the world, that's useful. In other domains, it's less useful. So yeah, I see them as complementary, but happy to discuss further with if anyone has questions.
Love it. Thank you. So moving on in the chat, we next have a comment from Steve on what do you say there at 928, Steve?
Oh, okay. That's not 928 for me. So that's 12. How am I babbling about? Oh, yeah. That's an interesting, right? So the idea is, I think this framework seems detailed enough. Obviously, I haven't looked at the paper yet, but you could feed that and any sort of procedural documentation you have from an organization and just let the LLM figure it out, how well it conforms to your levels and your dimensions and so on and so forth.
For sure,
It's
yes.
like a great tool. You know,
Have you,
I'm going to do it immediately.
great, glad to hear it.
Thanks, Steve. Now the next questions are from Joseph Goebbels. I wanted to introduce him. He's actually Metagov's political theory fellow, and someone I really enjoy exchanging points with. And so, yeah, happy that Luke and Joseph can meet here. And Joseph, do you want to come in with some of your questions about representation?
Yeah, sure. Hi, very nice to meet you. I read the paper already and a while ago found it interesting. Sorry, I don't have my camera on. I've got my laptop packed away to move. But there's kind of two things, both regarding representation in the paper. The first one, I guess I'll do in the reverse order. The easier problem maybe is that I didn't see representation defined anywhere, nor a source pointed to that clearly seemed to be defining it. It seems implicit that you're talking about descriptive representation, especially with the references to sortition. But I think the lack of a clear statement of what representation as a verb or as a noun means, or what representativeness or representative as a noun means, I feel like that's going to make it hard to evaluate the representativeness of a process and hard to make recommendations about how to make a process more representative. So like if someone comes out and says, it's representative because these are elected representatives, and so parliament is the most representative thing imaginable, we might want to say, well, no, it's not very representative because most of them are rich, or most of them are men, or something like that. Or I might take a process and I might say like, well, it's really representative along demographic lines, but for some reason, 30% of people in the population really care about climate change and they really want to do something about it right now. And that's not very represented in the group. So maybe it's not very representative by ideas, even if it's representative by demographics. So I think that's something that obviously is difficult and requires like taking stances. And I think it could be worth saying like, you know, different people are going to have different views and we think these are two like or three valid views. But I think that would be something that would be really, really important to make this applicable, is clearly defining representation. And then the kind of deeper problem from my perspective is that you take representation to be one of the core subdimensions for evaluating how democratic a process is. And I think we could say, for the sake of argument, that maybe representative processes and methods are the best that we know of for achieving certain democratic goals. But I think taking representation itself to be identical to those goals leads to some non-ideal results when trying to apply this rubric. Like if I had a maximum participation for a group, like I'm trying to make a decision for a town of 500 people, and somehow I can get all 500 people to show up to a couple different weekends to discuss this problem. Well, there's no representation because they're all present. So that process would be maximally undemocratic because there's zero representation. Or just if that's obviously like kind of an edge case, maybe that's not going to occur very often. But if I'm trying to increase the participation in my process, that's doing nothing on your rubric to make it more democratic, because it's not necessarily increasing representation, and it's likely decreasing representation, at least somewhat, because certain groups are going to be more able to participate or more likely to find the website inviting them or whatever. So I'm wondering how, for one, if you guys did think through how you're defining representation, and maybe you made a decision to exclude that, or if there's kind of maybe some disagreements in the group, and so you didn't want to take a stance. And then second, if what you think about this problem of kind of baking representation into the definition of democracy in the paper.
Yeah, well, to start with, thank you for the super thoughtful comments. And yeah, I'll be thinking more on each of them. I broadly, so two aspirations for this framework are both to connect it better with political theory as we iterate on it, and we do like our aspiration, which is probably imperfectly achieved at the moment, is that it does apply to democracy in general, even though I guess a lot of the other things that many of the co-authors are working on are more in the deliberative democracy space. So that definitely had an influence. I think we left out a definition of representation mainly to try and abstract away from like we're aware of the different conceptions of it in political theory, but it was just like an area of contestation we didn't want to get into, but I think it would be good to sort of grapple with that more substantively. Your example of a case where everyone shows up to make a decision and that being sort of absent of representation, in my head, that's sort of like maximal or like optimal representation where everyone's representing themselves if you allow for people to represent themselves. I guess correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a political theorist or a democratic theorist, but my understanding of like a contrast that people might often draw between more representative notions of democracy and other forms of democracy might be something like the contrast might be with something that's more agonistic, and there's a lot more sort of contestation, but there's less focus on electing representatives or descriptively representing through sortition any particular polity. So I think the framework could do a better job of certainly handling that that alternative conception of democracy. I'd be curious for your thoughts on that, and if anyone else wants to chime in on the conflation of representation with democracy, I'd be curious for thoughts as well. Steve?
Maybe I'll let Steve go first, yeah.
I mean, like, I'm as outside, you have a very good box, but I don't even know where the box is. So being able to find your box that is so, intricate and ornate will give me the exact platform I need to then innovate off of those assumptions and, live in those interstitial spaces that aren't accounted for. So I look forward to diving into this in depth and, getting into all the nitty-gritty details. For example, I have conceptions of democracy as something that can also be built from the ground up. I'm going to be putting up immediately after this meeting my first draft of my fiduciary framework for AI agents. And that's a way that any set of individuals can aggregate into a democratic process. So I think for the most part, top level democracy is lost. It's going to just wither on the vine, hopefully, if we can rebuild from underneath. But looking at this framework is a way to contrast my work very effectively with the status quo. So I look forward to digging into it.
Yeah, maybe just to really quickly follow up, I don't want to derail entirely, but I think one thing, the definition, I definitely think that's something that is, I feel like at least worth identifying the places that people are going to be discussing this, because I do think there are like some very clear camps where some people, like I'm not sure how much you guys engaged with the representation literature, and also I would be more than happy to share sources if this is something that you're continuing to work on, but there's going to be really big disagreements between people who think that representation means my ability to act in a process through my representative who's just there as my delegate, versus people who think that as long as you are statistically demographically represented, like as long as there's someone there who looks mostly like me and someone else who's mostly my age and something like that, then the process is legitimate in making a decision for me. And that's a really, really big tension.
Yeah, why is
and I
that
think
tension there, do you think? In other words, is there an incentive to keep this sort of dumbed down version of representativeness that's being forwarded by certain people?
Oh, is that to me or Luke?
I think that was to you, Joseph, or Luke.
Uh, I I can't speak to in the paper. I feel like maybe avoiding attention and like it's only like 4 pages or something, right? So I can see the justification for that, but I think in the literature it's just like this has been debated for 3,000 years, so and it will probably be debated for 3,000 more. So it's I think that's just kind of implicit in the concept. But the bigger problem to me, I feel like it I think it would be really, really valuable to think through what are the goals that representation, as the authors understand it, is trying to deliver. Because whether or not it makes sense to say that someone's representing themselves, I think probably you're trying to get at something else that's underneath, like people's ability to live by rules that either are in their interest or they want to live by or they've made themselves or something like this. And representation might be like really, really good at achieving those goals, or it might not be. I'm kind of more on the side that it's not, but uh, I can't use this process to evaluate how well representative processes are achieving the goals, because representation is kind of like presumed in the rubric. So I think thinking through like the goals that representation, as you guys understand it and as you deploy it, is trying to achieve would be really valuable and maybe help. It might help also clarify some other parts of the rubric in your minds as well.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. As you've been talking, I think what we were trying to get at with representation, abstracted from the particular conceptions of it, is I think of the dimensions, it's the only one that sort of is a tether between the decision that's made and what the people in that public or polity want in some sense. That I think you could score highly on the rest of them. You could have a very deliberative process. You could have a very informed process. You could have a very tight coupling between the output of the decision-making process and the like system in which it is implemented or operationalized, but still have the decision be something that's completely out of left field and far removed from what people actually want in some sense, or some aggregation over what people want. So I think that's the role it's playing. But yeah, we need to make that more rigorous and grounded for sure.
Great. Well, let me jump in and pull on the informed thread a little bit. So kind of shifting to a different part of the content that Luke shared. In the chat, I said that I'd like to ask about the role of expertise, considering how technical this domain is. And we know the role of expertise in democracy in general is like another difficult area. And Luke, I'm wondering what you've learned from grappling with AI governance so far. And what kind of informational resources do you need to have? Does the educational phase that would normally go with the Citizens Assembly need to be greatly expanded? What kind of provisions do you offer to your participants so that they can get up to speed with the technology?
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Joseph, as well. I haven't personally been super closely involved in running processes in this space. I've sort of learned about various ones that have been run and I'm pretty familiar with them, but I'm not sure I'm necessarily the best person to speak to this, but like I think it's a challenge in general. To the extent possible, there are certain types of decisions around impacts from AI and how it's adopted that you can talk about the like normative trade-offs without getting into the details of how the technology works in some cases. I think that said, often having a deep intuition for how the tech works is often a bottleneck. So like, for example, I think we've all encountered the fact that a lot of people still have the intuition that ChatGPT say is, or like it's more confusing now than it was when it first came out, but the intuition that it's doing some search over a database when it comes back with an answer to you, which sometimes it is now searching the web, but oftentimes it's not. It's just sort of confabulating based on the training data it's seen, and it's not like there's some human readable database anywhere that it's consulting. But that's an intuition that a lot of people have about how these systems work, or just like the risk of hallucination, or ascribing intent or belief, or there's a lot of like intuitions people have about how generative AI works that aren't that close to the reality of the technology. So I think it's going to be a challenge for a long time and probably always. But I think, and also none of these dimensions also are like, we don't think you can do perfectly on any of them. You can do better or worse. They're all operationalized to degrees, and there's a cost involved to scoring better on each of them, which is why like the framework is sort of framed in, is the overall quality of or democraticness of the system, is it good enough to handle the level of decision making in a given context? It's all sort of trying to be pragmatic in the trade-offs and the costs involved in doing better or worse on these dimensions, including informedness. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's kind of about it.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I have my intuition about this space, more from a practitioner's standpoint, is that those incorrect intuitions that people come in with, without fully engaging with them, naming them and engaging with them and providing corrective information, educational attempts might fail to get people up to being able to be like informed participants in decisions. So I personally wouldn't want to be running a technical discussion without really engaging with what the mental models are, the people who are first entering the room. And yeah, this is kind of, it falls out of the area of democratic theory, but I just feel like it's so important when we think about, so how is it that people are actually forming their opinions? And I worry that this educational stage, this is general, this isn't to your paper or anything, Luke, but just generally that this educational phase like falls off the table when people are trying to construct like what is a good democratic system, and they miss the fact, they miss all of this, that people are coming out of an information ecosystem into whatever process that's been designed. And that process may or may not be enough to counteract the toxic or just misinformed levels of the home ecosystem. Guess that's more of a comment than a question. Oops.
No, it's fine. For sure.
I think, Liz, what you're saying kind of gets at what I wanted to hear Luke maybe speak on a little, which is like the actual use of the framework, and like and how you envision like organizations, maybe like on the implementator side, who are like being pressured to adopt AI to automate some processes, which it's like, okay, sure, there could be a helpful implementation of AI to make their jobs easier, especially in like nonprofit contexts or government contexts, but like kind of doing like a slower adoption of these tools, like where your tool might fit into that like process that is actively happening in these organizations, and like how to like, do you envision this being like a workshop that you could use this tool in some kind of workshop with these organizations, or like what kind of environments do you envision people using this framework in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of often there's like one advocate for more participatory democratic approaches within a larger organization which has other interests and incentives. So I think often we're targeting those advocates as people who need a bit more like an armory of language they can use to sort of articulate what better or worse looks like, and yeah, like sort of draw some hard distinctions around just how good a system is, but also the sort of like I think the framework can, our sort of hope is that it can be a common language that when companies or organizations adopting AI or deploying AI do well according to the term, like the terms of the framework, that's something that they can be sort of rewarded for and recognized externally as well. I think there's obviously more levels of detail that the framework doesn't get into, which I think would also be super helpful for people. And this also goes a bit to the political theory point. So I think, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, Joseph, but in my interactions with the literature, it was something that might be super helpful for someone in an organization making decisions would be like, just tell me which decisions should be democratic and which ones is it okay for them not to be democratic. I don't think existing democratic theory is sort of structured in a way that just like provides a checklist of criteria that helps someone who's not a democratic theorist make those judgment calls and to sort of defend them to other people in the organization. That's something I would love to do moving forward, is like help sort of just concretify, and yeah, definitely not universally accepted. But yeah, like sort of translating political theory and democratic theory in a way that makes it a bit more concrete and actionable, even if it's not universally accepted. If you could sort of build enough of a consensus around those kinds of sort of tools for making normative decisions as well, I think that would be super helpful.
Oh, thank you.
So we're at time. We're at the top of the hour. Luke, would you be available to take the one more question in the chat before you head off?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Lil D, do you want to briefly bring up your question?
Hi, yeah, I think Val got it. Basically, I was just interested in the application of the framework, because you could talk about democracy in terms of the inputs to creating an AI model, or controlling the output of the AI model to support democratic ideals and, for example, not to encourage people to suppress other voices. But then there's also this level of like democracy in terms of governing the social and political externalities of AI, for example, mass unemployment, automation, and so on. And so I was just kind of wondering like how you think about all of those levels integrating, because I'm not sure that they follow on from each other exactly. Like, I don't know that more democratic input means more democratic output. Yeah, but I think Val kind of got at this as well. So anyway.
No, it's a great question. I think this is getting into the domain of what decisions should be made democratically, which I've thought a bit about. I would like to think more about, but I guess at least for my own sense, I'm more convinced that the sort of the externalities, and I feel like there's a bunch of sort of massively consequential decisions which are sort of like forks in the road that society could go down as we adapt to AI. So like what I don't know, should agents have legal personhood, or to what extent should they many people will think the answer to those questions is obvious, and maybe there's a massive consensus on them already, but there's certainly not decisions that should be made by one guy in a room somewhere. They should have those sorts of like big trajectory questions, I think there's a strong case for them being made using some sort of democratic system. As you get to the more technical level of like particular systems and control over inputs and outputs of a particular system, I'm very uncertain in general, but you can imagine cases where like, so like the ARIA in the UK, some of you might be aware of Davidad's safeguarded AI vision of sort of deploying advanced systems in particular constrained domains with formal guarantees that they will adhere to some formal safety specification. And his proposal is that safety specification, which formally specifies a set of trade-offs between sort of observables or metrics in the world that capture things that people care about. That specification would be something that's developed with significant deliberative input. So that's one way in which you could, at the more like individual system level, constrain a system and use deliberative or democratic processes to make the questions about normative trade-offs. But
what's the particular paper you're referencing?
I'll give you the keywords to search to look for it, but ARIA safeguarded AI. Yeah, it'll come up from Google if you search that. But yeah, that doesn't quite factor it into inputs and outputs, but it factors it into what is the effect that this system has on the world when it's making decisions in a given domain.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke, for coming to this presentation. Thank you to you and all your contributors for assembling this important work. Speaking for myself, probably for the bulk of Metagov, we really look forward to following your progress. Luke and Joseph, I'm glad you two could meet. Maybe you could do some follow-up. And yeah, otherwise, everyone, we will see you on the Slack. And until next week's seminar, have a great day.
We can unmute clap for our speaker really quick before we log off. Thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.